Okay. So we're on Twitter now, not LinkedIn. But okay. Oh, okay. So we are live now. Let's let a few more people join first, and then we can begin. Good evening, everyone. So I'd like to welcome everyone to a very special edition of our Immersive Trails live streams. As you know, if you've been following us for a while, we tend to do these based on monthly themes or just things that we find interesting in terms of research and stuff like that. And today we have a very special guest here to help us launch our new initiative, the Culture Box. So the Culture Box is our attempt to bring Indian artisans into the limelight more and try to help make traditional crafts and artistic production sustainable in the long run. And Anmo will be joining after this session to talk a little bit more about that. But I will now introduce Dr. Chandan Bose. So he is an assistant professor of anthropology and sociology at IIT Hyderabad. And he has worked on basically how artisans produce knowledge and pass it down. So with no further ado, let me pass it over to you if you'd like to give a little introduction to some of your work, and then we can go into the more interactive part of the session.
Great. Hello, everybody, and hi. Thanks, Chelsea, for having me. It's a difficult time, but I suppose these conversations are important even more now. I'm an anthropologist by training, and my work primarily has looked at the way in which popular understandings of what craft and what a craftsperson is have been kind of given to us through different policies, through different what we call discourses of colonization, and questions regarding what is traditional art, what is folk art. I kind of unpack and critique these sort of categories, but also looking at how these categories permeate the everyday lives of the artisans and their work, and how their work comes to kind of either reconfigure these categories or conform to these categories. So I look at the politics of categories and classification and practice. That's the anthropological work that I do primarily.
Mm-hmm. Would you like to introduce a little bit about the area that you work in and the communities that you've worked with?
Sure. So my work primarily has been with a community of artisans in the Telangana region, what is popularly called as Nakashi artwork, and they belong to a hereditary community of practitioners based in the Telangana region, who specialize in the regional style of mural paintings, sculpture, and scroll narratives, right? And my work was, so I work with one specific family, the family of Bekuntam and Banuja Dhanalakota, and they're kind of they have two sons and a daughter. And I tried to kind of look at how the idea of the craft and the domestic space actually merge with one another. So the primary kind of premise that I work with is craft is one of the most kind of fundamental ways of flexible production, what we call post-Fordism today, that you work from home, but craft has always been in the South Asian region working from home, right? You've had workshops of weavers and sculptors and all kinds of blacksmiths and silversmiths working from home. So what does that actually do to the economy? What does that do to different aspects of the everyday life of the artisan, be it kinship, be it interpersonal relationships, um, and also how do they identify them? Like, what are the different ways in which that they identify themselves as craftspeople in the way that the government also sort of bestows this identity upon them as traditional artisans. So many times, um, if we've encountered artisans in any craft bazaar or in any kind of uh, artisanal village, they do quote unquote perform the way in which the craft is traditional. It's part of their heritage, so I try to kind of look at how these narratives are actually constructed, and how do they enter into their everyday lives. Um, so, so it's also looking at how do these artisans talk about their work and talk about their livelihood primarily. That's the work that I have done, and which also became the focus of my first monograph called Conversation with Craft. But now what I'm doing is actually looking at young second generation artisans who migrate to the city and who look to urbanization and technology as a kind of promise for the future. So I'm looking at youth inheritance in terms of skill and technology now vis-a-vis the whole infusion of craft that we have right now.
Okay, it's very fascinating. So going into the questions. So this is a very interactive session. If anyone has any questions at any point, please add them in the comments. So my first question for you is, what exactly does craft mean, or artisan, or handicraft?
Right. So I think what one can safely say now, given this point of the pandemic, is that craft certainly is not what they call an essential commodity, right? Because if I'm currently doing some field work in an artisanal village in Hyderabad called Shilparamam, and I've also spoken to a number of artisans over the course of last year, and they all are fine. I mean, they have once kind of they all narrate the same story about how they have lost business and how production has come to a halt, right? Because they keep saying that when the government kind of defined and classified what essential commodity was, craft was not a part of it, and they keep saying that craft is something of it's something to decorate your space with, and nothing more than that. And I think that's a very important kind of peg to answer this question, because so if you look at the word craft, I think it starts to emerge historically also at a very distinct point in time in Europe around the mid 19th century, especially as an anti-industrial revolution movement. Where you have where you have something called the arts and craft movement, which actually was meant to be a challenge or response or a critique of the industrial revolution. It also kind of it covered everything that the industrial revolution had sidelined. So it was speaking about the bucolic, it was speaking about hand, and it was speaking about alienation. About the relationship that the worker has with the object that one makes. So craft actually emerges as a category to kind of respond to what was seen as science and technology, right? But come to India, craft then becomes a very strong. It starts to have a very spiritual kind of uh, connotation, because at that time the anti-colonial movement and independence movement starts to emerge, right? So craft is seen as something that India possessed pre-colonially, and craft is something that India possessed as a spiritual tool, right? So it becomes a very strong tool for independence and carving out one's own identity. Okay, so it is also a word that emerges very specifically in the English language lexicon, and this is something which I keep telling my students, and and which I reiterate, that if you look at the Indian, or if you look at this, the South Asian kind of vocabulary, there is no separate word for art and craft. They both are the same, so it's either kala or shilpkar, right? So then this whole distinction that we have between art, which then takes on a very different angle, and art is supposed to then be something higher or elevated than craft, and craft is supposed to be this mechanical production or a more technical aspect of producing something. It has a very European kind of lineage to it, right? And that's something which we should not ignore, because that becomes the basic standard of so many kind of other artificial classification and divisions, right? In India, for example, you have something, or in South Asia, you have something called Margi and Desi, right? So Margi, but that is, so what popularly gets translated as classical and local is also seen as, could also be seen as Margi being the larger body and Desi then being a branch of it, So it's, but then given the way academia has also been, let's say, monopolized by the elite middle class Brahmin kind of gentry, Margi and Desi have acquired a very hierarchical value, that Margi is more superior than Desi, right? So to answer your question, what is craft? Craft, I think, as a word, as a concept, has a very specific historical function, and that function should not be forgotten, right? But at the same time, I think as we also move down or kind of emerge from independence and post-independence, we also find the time when policy started having a tough time to actually even identify this ambit of craft, right? So you had all kinds of things, from textiles to ceramic to jute to bamboo to rope making, all clubbed under craft. The question is, why are these different materials and different processes of making clubbed under craft, And even in a lot of the government archives, they were constantly vacillating between how much of machine work is allowed to call something a craft, which we're still discussing, So if you look at the more recent kind of textile sort of policies, it's got to do with how much of handmade and power loom is allowed for it to be called handloom, right? So that becomes the other kind of thing, that where how does skill get defined primarily, which then also gets translated in the way institutions around craft are organized. So you have two different institutions. One is the cottage industries, and one is the Ministry of Textile, and you have Ministry of Culture, right? Three different bodies handling the same thing, but you have, say, bamboo, you have metal, you have jute under cottage industries, but you have textile and weaving under Ministry of Culture, right? So the rationale behind it is kind of random sometimes, and the biggest problem in managing an occupation which also covers like millions of people is that there is no dialogue between these departments, so that's where I think when one when one asks what we mean by craft, I mean, craft actually, again, if you go back to the word, it actually means being crafty, someone being a crafty person, it was actually an adjective to describe personality of a person. But now it's also, turned into this kind of consumption-oriented thing. So Glenn Adamson, who's a historian of craft, says that craft is anything that, so we call an object craft which in which the focus is on how it has been made. So when you look at a woven basket, it's the weave of the basket that draws our attention to, right? So it takes attention away from the final product to the process of it, right? So, or craft could be anything in which is anything through which you do it very well, right? So that's the another definition by Richard Sennett. So it then becomes a kind of if one has to answer it conceptually, it's also it's the craft can be a product and a process, right? So it is through the making that knowledge is also gained, but also through that knowledge that the product emerges. So in philosophical language, it's what we call techne, Techne, which is basically the art of knowing through making. So making and knowledge are not separate, but part of each other's kind of histories. So of course now when we look at, so if the concept of craft itself is so problematic and constantly shifting its boundaries, then the craftsperson becomes equally kind of difficult to identify. But right now, what we work with, or what the government works with for all practical purposes, is a craftsperson is one who holds an artisan identity card.
And how do you get that?
So that's a process so you have something called the DC handicraft, which is the Development Commission handicraft in different talukas and different sort of locations in the country, right? So what artisans do is what people do is they go and register themselves, So either artisans or a novice, what would happen is that you have these government workshops on skill upgradation. For example, in the family I worked with, Vaikuntham, Vanaja, and his wife and rest of the family, they were conducting these skill workshops in Cherial painting, training people in Cherial in their village in this style of painting, and it was a 6-month kind of workshop, at the end of which the people who completed the workshop would get a certificate, and they were then allowed to go and register with DC Handicrafts to get an artisan card, right? And this artisan card then allows them to access different spaces and different kind of programs like health insurance, exhibitions. So to be able to sit in a Delhi Heart or to sit in a Swabhumi, I'm also guessing which is in Calcutta, or Shilparamam in Hyderabad, you need to have an artisan identity card, right? But there are also now the institution of brokerage has entered into this system where there are brokers who then give businessmen who run businesses hiring artisans, and these artisans don't have the artisan identity card, but the business owners do. So they go to exhibitions and sell products because they have the artisan identity card. So it becomes sort of a very myopic way to then identify who this craftsperson is, right? But the other kind of thing about the craftsperson, which then enters into the discourse, is that our understanding of a craftsperson or craft skill is that one craftsperson has one kind of skill. So the metal worker works only with metal, or the painter works only with canvas, but that's historically not true,
No.
So you have communities who work with leather and metal and canvas simultaneously, So they changed their skill depending on where they were moving, in the region they were moving, and on the patronage they were getting, right? So if you come down south, you have so many communities who were in the army, right? Who were from the military background and making saddles, right? So that turned into embroidery because they were stitching, and that then turned and because when they were stitching, they were even painting these objects. So that turned into kind of painting, right? So this idea of craft and craft person being a monolithic institution, that one person has one skill and one community has one skill, that's actually a fallacy which we've kind of developed over this whole obsession with capitalist specialization, right? Um, and the other thing which also which I want to quickly add is the question of agriculture, right? So no person was simply an artisan, right? There were also people who own land, but it's also because of the shrinking agricultural sector that then this has become into a like I said, a singular and monolithic institution.
Well, thank you. I have one example of someone who we've recently discovered does a lot of different things.
Right.
So, gosh, what's his name? The guy who makes the Dashavatr Tash in Vishnupur.
Right.
He actually is the one who also makes a number of other products that we've found, because often, like, we went around and we're like, oh, who makes this? And then they say, oh, it's him.
Right.
So he makes idols for Durga Puja and things like that as well.
Correct,
Sital
yeah.
Fojdar. Thank you, dear.
Yeah.
My husband gives his name.
Right,
Sital Fojdar. So he makes idols for Durga Puja. He makes masks for various festivals.
Right.
He makes other things that have to do with painting and stuff. So it's not that he is only making these cards, even though that's his most famous production. He does other things as well, which is really interesting.
Yeah. So the other thing which actually now has come up is also this whole thing of intellectual property rights, right? That has contributed to this idea of the singular craftsperson, but also a singular place, So there is something called geographical indication, which is part of the TRIPS agreement, which is trade and trade-related property rights act. That's what. Which is part of the whole kind of, of course, the UN, the WTO's kind of attempt to safeguard products, which actually began in Europe with cheese and wine, and then they've kind of moved out to it here, right? So a lot of work, for example, Madhubani, for example, right? Now, Madhubani is now located so it's a GI product, which means that a product is considered authentic only if it comes from this region. Now, mind you, when the artisan is applying for a GI certificate, she or he has to give the actual coordinates of the place. So I have actually seen documents where so Cherial painting is called Cherial painting because Vaikuntham had applied for a to have it registered in a GI, and the application form has the exact coordinates of GI. So anyone who's working on Cherial outside, working on these paintings outside Cherial, is not considered authentic, which is what's happening in with the Kanjivaram Sari right now, right? So the GI indication also mentioned the GI certificate requires the exact mode of production. So what are the materials used? What is the kind of labor involved? So now something like the Kanjivaram Sari, which requires a specific kind of shuttle loom and some amount of gold and silver in the thread, which is very difficult for a medium-sized weaver to produce, who is now located outside Kanchipuram, will not be given that GI tag. You know? And also this whole kind of association and fixing of place, because if you look at knowledge of a certain kind, that knowledge is never restricted to one place. So especially the artisan community moved, right? And with them, as they move from place to place, they would absorb knowledge and kind of share knowledge with other communities in different places. So in the case of Telangana, so Cherial painting has a GI certificate, and Nirmal Toys and Paintings, which is known for these very kind of hyper real objects made of wood, is known for a separate kind. It has a separate GI tag. But the Nirmal artisans and the Cherial artisans belong to the same community. right? And they would make each other's stuff. But now what's happened is that they need to now market themselves as separate, right? So that's the other thing which has entered this whole kind of specialization with place and one particular kind of object. The other interesting thing is also what happens when we associate one craft with one place. So Madhubani right now has something around 5 lakh Madhubani artists. All people in Madhubani make Madhubani paintings, right? Now, why is that? I mean, so there needs to be work to understand what was the economy in Madhubani before Madhubani painting got famous, right? And this started happening in the 70s, right? So the entire economy change of Madhubani, right? The same started happening in Khurja in UP, where now everyone started to make these glazed ceramic ware, right? So what happens to even the economy of a place when when we try to kind of fix practice and communities, and that's caused a huge kind of it's caused a lot of imbalance in the whole ecology of the whole institution, right? Because now especially in the case of Madhubani, because there's so much supply and so much production, that now that they are still scrounging for alternatives to make this entire thing sustainable. So yeah, that's definitely there. The whole point about looking at craft and craftspeople as a singular kind of uh, entity. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have a question. Rishika asks, in your research, have you come across a strong caste association with craft communities? And is social mobility a motivation for a new generation who would want to move away from craft?
Yeah, so so I think that's what makes actually craft in South Asia very different from if you see craft and the way craft works in the Americas, because of caste, because all craft communities are also caste communities, you know, and so historically knowledge uh, was also then restricted within this community, and a lot of, and especially when you started with colonization, when technology entered into the sphere, it was only the landed within the community who were then able to benefit from the technology, right? um, so caste leaders also became the craft leaders, you know. But in terms of more, if the question is more oriented towards the purity and pollution aspect of craft, then definitely yes. So TM Krishna's recent work on the rhythm rhythm Mridangam makers of Kerala is that, right? Because they use leather to make craft. So that whole idea of using leather and dung is still kind of associated um, with um, with craft, right? But also the other way in which caste works very subtly in craft is also looking at the way in which these workshops, the government workshops, sort of operate, because these workshops are called Guru Shishya Parampara, which means the master and disciple. Now, Guru Shishya Parampara works within a very patriarchal caste system, you know. So even though a lot of the novices who enter these workshops are not from the craft, are not from that community, they eventually enter into relationships of obligation that kind of mirror caste in that way, you know. So my recent article in a journal called Contemporary South Asia does actually deal with this, how caste gets replicated in these secular frameworks of government programs, you know. But no, caste definitely works very strongly in this. I mean, if you look at even the Patua artists, right? I mean, you have work by Beatrix Hauser, if you want to refer to, which looks at conversion of Patwa artists to Islam, right? To actually then to then find a way out of the of the lower caste kind of stigma, and of course, work on Dalit crafts has always been sort of, has been there. The second question is social mobility, motivation for new generation. Yes, it is. But the other interesting then finding that one comes across is that, so again, I can give you an example from Andhra Pradesh. So a lot of younger generation weavers, called the Padmasali community in Andhra Pradesh, have left weaving, but not the cloth industry. So they join factories and mills as quality checkers. So then one has to then understand what does mobility then across occupations mean. you know but actually the thing right now is that, for example, the family I work with, Vaikuntham, his sons are taking on the mantle of sort of going forth with the craft, because they have found patronage and sponsorship from the government beneficial for them, right? So now they are all they sell their stuff on Amazon, on WhatsApp. So there are these different kinds of, I think, and of course the very popular narrative of the new generation not wanting to enter into the craft, right? So there are three different kinds of scenarios here, right? So one, we have to understand what is mobility, because people leave the skill but stay within the industry. One is that they are continuing with it, and that's what my work is. So second generation artisans who kind of move outside the village and come into the city, looking for a new kind of market. And then of course the more popular understanding of leaving the craft. So I think it's a variety of phenomena. We need to understand what motivates which, right? At what point in time in history.
Yeah. Okay. You've covered a lot of my questions, so let me see what I can put together here. So what do you mean when you use the term craft knowledge?
Right. So I think, so going back to what I said earlier about technique, right? And the act of knowing through making, right? So I think one of the important things of craft knowledge is looking at the experience, right? And how it is experiential. And I think one of the main sort of ways to kind of understand it is to kind of also look at how we have inherited certain ways of understanding from science. Science tells us that one has to understand. Science A tells us that the word, so evidence needs to be of a certain sort, right? Science tells us that there is a certain way in which evidence has to also has to be presented for it to be legible and coherent, right? Now, once again, all these sort of work very. I mean, they did probably work very well in the European context, but when we move this thing to South Asia, and so a lot of work is being done around science and technology studies, or what's called STS in the East or in the global South, right? Where one is looking at the idea of, can experience be another kind of knowledge, right? So looking at the relationship between body and materials. So if you look at that's the interesting thing. So while I was kind of doing my field work for my book, and I would ask Vaikuntham about how he made a particular color, he was never able to give me measurements. He said, when the color becomes this, or when the viscosity becomes like this, I know it's done. And he kept using the word andaz se karna padta hai. Now that's something which we also are very familiar with ourselves, right? I mean, when you're driving, a new driver is very conscious about how much of the brake to press, how much of the accelerator to press, right? Or when you're cooking, the term andaz, which is then a kind of informed judgment, but andaz also depends on the context, right? So based on that context, you will do this, right? So it's also negotiating based on your environment, and that environment could be anything. So especially in craft, because a lot of material depends on the weather, right? So if it's humid, if it's dry, if it's rainy, the mixtures will change, and then they rely on their bodies. They rely on so what is called muscle memory, like cycling, you know. So craft knowledge then relies on this idea of experience, of history, right? But what we need to then understand is that we can't be using the same registers of formal science to kind of move in that direction, But I mean, after all, if you ask what is science, science is basically, I mean, the idea of the experiment. The experiment is by nature very messy. It is supposed to be messy. So the entire very popular image of the mad scientist kind of, burning things in his lab, right? But then that messy knowledge then is then represented in a very coherent manner in a lab report, right?
Yeah.
So that's the idea. So I mean, so if science also is also a certain kind of, I mean, so there is so much of work done within the discipline of history where craft and science are also seen as one. So alchemists, right, were also craft people, So metalwork or metal casting. There's a very interesting book called The Artisan and His Body by Pamela Smith, who's based in Colombia, and she looks at how it was through artists who were replicating nature on their canvases that science then started to understand accuracy. So then, of course, the question then, how do we understand what craft knowledge is, right? And looking at this whole sort of uh, division that we've kind of established between craft as a mechanical process, right, and art as a more mental, elevated sort of superior sort of way, which then also enters into the realm of what we know by style,
Yeah.
So craft is seen as almost like this replicating thing, like it's a formelic. So if you see the work of one Madhubani artist, you've seen the work of all Madhubani artists because it's the same. But contemporary art is supposed to be unique, each piece is different on their own. But if you speak to artisans, if you speak to craftspeople, they do talk about their own individual style and how they can differentiate between different people's styles. So some people's styles, so some strokes are thick, some strokes are thinner. Some people talk about the direction of the brush. So they have their own kind of cues and registers to sort of to work with it. And it's very interesting because once Vaikutam told me that as a craftsman, I don't have the pressure that a contemporary artist has to produce new work every time,
Yeah.
And I find
True.
that really interesting, because then he's also addressing the issue of the market, because that's what I mean. So it's actually the market that actually makes these two things of traditional craft and contemporary art different. But I mean, a lot of it, I think, conceptually has the way in which we understand what craft knowledge actually is.
So going back to the idea of a craft as an essential commodity, we've kind of come to understand that because of the pandemic as, the things which the government allows to be shipped to you.
Yeah.
But also in terms of looking back in history, um, these craft items were just normal items that people use. So, what, like, can you talk a little bit more about how this shift happened from being a normal everyday item, which is used by everybody, to more of something which is considered a decoration or something like that?
Right. So I think a lot is also, like I said, it had to do with, I think, the idea of sustainability within household economies. Um, so s- what? So I think when we look at the institution of the handmade, or let's put it, objects of the everyday, right? They worked within a certain economy and within a certain network, right? So the potter, the weaver would all come together then at the funeral of a person, because that was what the economy kind of was, that was how even communities were organized around certain everyday occurrences within the community, you know. But even without giving this kind of very sort of let's say idyllic picture, um, some something which again I was told during my fieldwork is that so earlier the Nakashi community would make, I mean, not only were they painters but they were also sculptors, like the person you mentioned in Vishnupur, and they used, so people, whenever person, so if a person had broken an arm or a foot, or like had some ailment, they would come to the Nakashi and commission the Nakashi to make a miniature hand or a foot, and that they would then offer to the deity once the ailment would be cured, right? But then once you have modern medicine, people stopped believing in that, and so it stopped, going there. So it's also a matter of patronage,
Yeah.
right? That becomes very important. That how at what point does it become? At what point does it then exist by itself? So, for example, the Nakashis were also the scroll makers. Now there's a chain. So you have a community of practitioners like the weavers. Then you had the community of storytellers who would tell the who would kind of narrate the history of the weaving community, and you had the Nakashi painters. So the weavers would commission the storytellers to tell their story, and the storytellers would commission the Nakashi painters to paint the scroll. Right now, they're all interconnected. But once you start having the cooperatives, and the cooperatives kind of pretty much took autonomy away from individual weavers and weaving communities, they stopped patronizing the storytellers. And the storytellers then stopped commissioning the Nakashi artists, So then the Nakashi artists didn't have the need to produce these scrolls. So the scrolls didn't become essential commodity. The scroll then became into museum pieces, right?
Yeah.
And of course, that's the other kind of a kind of let's say route which enters, or another kind of discourse that enters the whole idea of museumization of craft, but and then you have a spate of, and this is during just pre-independence and post-independence, the kind of art colleges that started opening, because what started happening is that, especially, I think, so we do a lot of work has been done about blaming the British for the condition of Indian handicrafts, but actually the British did do a lot to actually even revive in handicrafts, right? Because when British commodities started coming into India, a lot of artisans started copying the British style because they thought that was the market, which again tells us about the versatility of these artisans, So they didn't work with concepts like tradition. They were skilled artisans who could make anything you ask them to make, right? So, but then it was actually the indigenous elite in India who then said that, oh, India is losing its authenticity because our artisans are copying British style. So then that starts to become extremely orientalized in India. And then you have all these schools that started to teach Indian artisans Indian art itself. And what
Yeah.
started happening was the way in which it was taught. So it's a very formal curriculum of sketching, drawing, coloring starts to emerge, which is not the way that even artisan communities today even work, right? So that linear system of pedagogy starts to enter, right? And with this linear system of pedagogy and art school, you also have the strict division between craft and design. So craftspeople, they were never designers. So it was it was the connoisseur who was giving the design, right, and the craftsperson implementing it, which we still find today. So a lot of the design workshops make this mistake, right, about kind of dictating to craftspeople what they should make.
Yeah.
But the question of essential commodity is important right now because I mean, and India can sort of take a lot of roadmap from other countries. I think it's Indonesia, which has a policy that every public building, I think 1/3 or like a fraction of the building has to be made by indigenous artisans. So something of that sort.
Yeah, that would be really helpful.
Exactly, right. So over the pandemic, one has learned that the sale of musical instruments has increased. Now, the point is, why are we not capitalizing on it, right? So if there's so much online classes, if there's so much of private education happening, if you introduce music as an element, so then, be it the guitar, be it the sitar, be it the sarod, this can enter into a more sort of, mainstream sort of feature about um, about making these instruments, because even making these instruments is a craft in itself, because you need people. So Mexico has a whole kind of industry of guitars, which they have sort of turned into a very lucrative industry, right? So that definitely is there. Or the other understanding of looking at, let's say, grass weaving, make products. So of course there is the idea of time, and so one is always one is always debating about that about the temporal aspect in craft, that it takes too long to make as opposed to manufactured commodities. But there have been cases where, for example, sikki grass has been merged with kind of plastic to make something. So I think it's just a matter of kind of collaborating and having a dialogue with one another, which is important.
Yeah. So I think the last question that I have at the moment is basically, how can crafts and artisans be supported, especially now during the pandemic, when it's very difficult for people to, and unsafe for people to actually travel and meet people and buy things directly. So how is it currently organized? How is the market currently organized? And how can we, as private citizens and consumers, help to support the artisans and ensure that these crafts continue?
Right. So I think one thing which I've always maintained is that, as you said, the market runs on market research. The market runs on data, and the market is always obsessed with understanding consumer practices and trends, right? Now, that is something which the craft sector in India has kind of ignored, because if you look especially at the pandemic right now, there is they have been reports about it, right? About how gardening has increased in the country. Like I said, how the sale of musical instruments has increased in the country. So a lot of stuff, a lot of kind of activities have now emerged. Now in this case, something like gardening. So the idea of making pots, musical instruments, right? Like figuring out or commissioning more artisans to make them. Okay, so I think one of the biggest issues that I think the craft sector faces is sort of relating market data with the directory of skills that one has. You know, um, so so that's the first thing I think what that one needs to do is actually generate the kind of data and skills that that one that that a specific region has, and looking at how that can be related to current consumption practices, right? I was recently interviewing a ceramic worker from Khurja, and he was saying that, see, we will never run out of business because people will always need cups and saucers, right? And now that there is this whole environmental kind of, anxiety about using plastic, that can be capitalized on, right?
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
yeah. So I think, and I'm only giving you surface sort of answer, because there is so much more. If one only needs to think from that perspective, that what are the products that a weaver or a blacksmith can make. So baking became a big thing, right? During the pandemic. Now you have so many blacksmiths making all kinds of utensils, right? Now, so that's one aspect. The other thing is train them to sell stuff on places like Amazon. So when I went, so in my recent round of interviews, all the artisans have said that we've tried to register on Amazon, we've tried to put our products out there, but it's so complicated, like the GST and all, and God knows what. That at the end of it, we just don't do it.
Yeah.
Because they say that we do have products. I mean, we can't stop making them, right? Because that's our bread and butter. So we have go downs and houses full of our products. And we know that people want them. We just need an avenue to sell them, right? And now the biggest thing the problem that the pandemic has brought in is mobility,
Yeah.
and the craft industry depends on mobility. So even people so all the artisans who sit in Delhi Hat or Shilparamam, they do have the base in the cities, but they constantly moving across their own hometown and coming back. So if there are these online exhibitions, and that's something which like I think organizations like yours could do, like if can figure out an online exhibition of stuff in an area based on the kind of needs that are there, based on the kind of practices that people are engaging with. So it can be very, very local as well. I think the biggest kind of task is to actually do a mapping of what are the skills and that are present in one locality, right? And what are the consumption trends in locality, and how the two can be met. So that's the idea. I think that's the biggest challenge in the pandemic right now, because I mean, we've come to a point in economic history where mobility is what sort of is the most important, right? And that's what the pandemic has done. So what then what we need to do is replace mobility with micro studies, with understanding localities and local skills and local markets and local demands. That's what um, it's all about, basically.
Great. So If anyone else has any questions, please add them to the comments. If not, then I will thank Dr. Bose for this very illuminating session. Okay.
Great.
So thank you very much
Thank you, Chelsea.
for agreeing to come on here and talk about your research and how crafts work today in India, especially during the pandemic. And next up is Anmol, our team member Anmol, to introduce the culture box and what we're doing there. So, yeah, thank you, Dr. Bose, and Anmol, you have the floor.
Yes. So, first off, I would like to start by thanking Dr. Bose for that talk. And as Chelsea said, it was very illuminating and it also gives us some food for thought on what our approach should be with, the new launch that we're coming up with. So, before I start, I should introduce myself. My name is Anmol Grover, and I am a team member of Immersive Trails. Now, so at Immersive Trails, of course, for those of you who have been following us for a while, of course, we do run heritage walks. We run, different sorts of experiences, workshops, and things like that that revolve around history, heritage, and culture. And in doing so, we were thinking for a while now, definitely a couple of years, to come up with initially some Kolkata specific merchandise because of course, for those of you who know, when we started off, we were Heritage Walk Calcutta because all of our operations were primarily in the city of Kolkata and centered around, adjoining parts. But of course, in September of last year, we actually rebranded as Immersive Trails, and that's actually when we decided to widen our scope to just beyond the city of Kolkata and even beyond Bengal in that sense. And so that's when every time we would have a discussion about merchandise, of course, we wanted to do something which was city specific, so specific to different cities across India, specific to different regions. But we were quite unsure of, so we didn't just want to have typical things like postcards and bookmarks and essentially just typical souvenir items. We wanted to have something apart from that as well, and that's why it took us a little bit of time to actually conceptualize what we are launching today, known as the culture box. So what happened is, of course, last year we were all hit with the pandemic, and which is still unfortunately raging on. But once the lockdown restrictions were lifted, that was also a point when we had just rebranded and we were looking to sort of expand our offerings beyond the city of Kolkata. So we actually did manage to travel to a couple of different regions in the state, within the state itself. And when we did that, we actually realized that there are so many things that we can offer from these regions which people would not be able to see anywhere else. And we also realized that there were a lot of different things like craft forms and just different objects that you would get from these small towns and villages, and which you would not particularly either get in bigger cities, and even if you would get them, they would be diluted. So in a sense that they would not be handmade and they would essentially be machine made. So it was not an original essentially that you were getting. So, in this process of traveling, we actually realized that it would be great if we could do something to bring these local crafts to the fore. And that's actually when I remember that I had, I was having a conversation with both our founders, Dr. Nyogi and Chelsea, and they just put across this term to me. So they said, okay, so we're giving you this term. It's the culture box, and what does that bring to your mind? Like, what do you think about it? What do you think it could be? So I said a couple of things just off the top of my head, but then when I actually thought about it, I told them that I had recently come across this trend of having subscription boxes or curated boxes of different items that that is essentially organizations or different establishments put on offer every month. So every month has a different list of curated items, and essentially that's how they sell it as a curated box. And when I said that is when both of them said that that's exactly what we are hoping to do with the culture box. And that's essentially how the culture box was formed. Now, essentially, what we aim to do with the culture box is that we aim to, of course, the main item, which is the box itself, will be a curated box of different items which are specific to a certain region or a certain city or town. And it will be, of course, a curation of a couple of items, but also from these visits that we do to the different regions, different towns and villages and all of that, we will also be sourcing certain collectors items and certain unique products which you would which you also do get in these places. So for people who don't want to buy the box, then you have these other single items that you can also purchase. But of course, we don't mean this to be sort of buying in bulk. So we're not going to be procuring in bulk, because we want to sort of keep that uniqueness. And we also want to make you feel that if you're purchasing something from the culture box, essentially you have something that is unique and something that is not particularly available for everybody. Now, how we really sort of narrowed down on this entire sort of our how to work with the culture box and how to actually build a mechanism for it. This happened when we actually traveled to Bishnupur. So we traveled to Bishnupur earlier in the year, and that's when we actually had the chance to speak with a number of artisans and a number of different craftsmen who work in the city itself. And that those interactions actually really helped us with building our model. So essentially, what we aim to do with the culture box is, the first thing is to create awareness about these crafts. Now, it's not only creating awareness about an end product or a finished product, but creating an awareness about the entire process. Because essentially, when it comes to handicrafts and handlooms, it's an entire process. It's not just what you see with with a finished product. And you're essentially what you when you pay. So you do tend to pay a higher price. Some people think is a higher price for a handicraft or a handloom, but that's the only reason you feel like you're paying a higher price is because you're not you don't understand the actual process that it takes to make that product, the number of people it takes, the amount of time it takes. So the first thing, of course, that we aim to do is to create an awareness about the different sort of crafts, especially the ones that are at risk of getting wiped out, simply because they've lost patronage. And especially now with with the pandemic, the way it's affected these craftsmen, they in most cases it isn't lucrative enough for them to actually continue. So we are hoping to sort of kind of slow down that process and maybe give add on to their patronage by initially creating awareness. Then of course we also aim to actually record and document the process of creating these products, creating these handmade products. And in doing so, we want to sort of create a knowledge base, because in the near future, if we are unfortunate enough to actually lose out on these different crafts and these different practices and traditions, then if you have that sort of knowledge base to look back on, then it may be easier for people to actually learn these crafts once more and actually start sort of doing them themselves and start doing them again. And the other thing, and one of the main things that we also want to sort of encourage, is for people to actually start sourcing directly from the artisans themselves. Because the typical problem that happens in most cases is that the bulk of the money that you pay for these products, of course, you are paying essentially more than what you would pay if you just buy a machine made product or a general product that you would get in cities. When the bulk of the money that you pay for these handmade products, unfortunately, most of it does not reach into the artisans' pockets themselves, even though it's them who have actually really invested their time, their expertise, and their money to actually, produce this item for you. So we aim to, of course, in that sense, what we aim to do is when we source products from artisans, either we hope to have a system in which we can pay them either in advance, or we can pay them, essentially on procuring the product itself. Because when we were there in Vishnupur, a lot of the artisans and a lot of the weavers actually told us that they had these big organizations, including the government actually, that would come and source products from them. But unfortunately, they were not paid, when they were not paid in advance, there was no really sort of system of an advance payment, or they were paid a very measly sum. And then essentially, they were only paid after those products were sold, where they were being sold. And even then they would be paid months or years later, after a very rigorous follow up from the artisan themselves. So this then creates a problem of actually, where do they have the money to actually sustain themselves, where do they have the money to actually go on with their craft, if you're not paying them outright for the products that you've already bought from them. So we aim to mitigate that, and we also aim to, so whatever the products that we're selling, the price that we're selling them at, we also aim to put back, a part of the profits, to give it back to the artisans themselves over and above the price that we have already paid to them. And another conscious decision that we decided to take was to pay the artisans the price that they ask from us outright, because of course a lot of people tend to bargain and things like that. But so we earlier had a talk this evening by Madhurima Chaudhary, who spoke to us about the art of or the craft of balujari. And she actually said that why do we tend to bargain with these people, when if we walk into a showroom or if we walk into a restaurant, we don't bargain, we don't, we pay the price that's asked for. So why do we tend to bargain with with craftsmen? So essentially we want to also, we have decided to make a very conscious decision to just pay them the amount. And it was very disheartening that we picked up a collector's item, which essentially, which is a very intricately carved conch shell. And the artisan, he's one of the only, or the only remaining artisan who still works with conch shells in Vishnupur. And he was actually hesitating to tell us the price of the product, because he thought that if he actually quotes a price which is fair to him, we might find it too high and we might leave. But and that's actually when we had this conversation with him, and he actually told us that because of the dwindling patronage and his dwindling business, he had actually decided to leave the craft and to actually join a factory. And it just so happened that we ended up visiting him, and we actually did manage to pick up a lot of the beautiful products that he's created. And we really hope that he is able to sustain that, because now there are no more people who actually work with conch shells in the region anymore. So, in doing so, these are essentially the couple of things that we really want to focus on with the culture box. And of course, I would like to end this by introducing our first lineup of products. So, for those of you who have been following us for a while, you would have known, of course, that we travel to Bishnupur, and all of the products that we have included in our first lineup are all products that have been sourced from Bishnupur itself. So, of course, the main culture box, or the main curated box, that we have only 10 numbers of that box on offer. And that includes a baluchari cushion cover. It also includes a pair of shark bangles, very intricately carved. And it also includes a one Dashavatar or Ganjifa playing card. And along with that, we also have a terracotta figure of the Bakura horse, or a couple of other animal figurines, essentially what the region is known for. And apart from that, we also have a recipe card with a local delicacy from the region itself. And to round it all off, we have also taken a decision to not use any plastic, or to use very minimal plastic, and to keep all or most of our packaging sustainable, and of course eco-friendly as well. So we decided that why not use a product that is indigenous to the region, or that is very the region is very famous for. So that's when we decided that why not pack all of these products and pack the box in a gamcha, in a cotton towel, which the region is very famously known for. So that is, of course, the last product that we are including in that curated box itself. But apart from that, if you actually take a look at our Culture Box website, you will see that there are two other very special and unique items on offer as well. And one of them is a beautiful Svarnachari Sari. So essentially, it's the same as Baluchari Sari, but it's got a beautiful weave of silver threads. And actually, in the sunlight, it changes. It looks like it changes color. So sometimes it looks like a very pale gold, whereas in other artificial lighting, it actually looks silver. It's an absolutely beautiful sari made from the softest silk. And it's definitely, it would be a great addition to your wardrobe if that's what you are looking for. And finally, the last item, which is a collector's item, which is a very, very special item, is an intricately carved conch shell. It's quite a massive conch shell. It's about 8 by 5 inches at its widest, weighs quite a bit. And it was, I mean, when we saw it, it absolutely took our breath away. And we just decided that we had to have this, and we really wanted sort of the artisan's work to be showcased on a larger platform. So these are currently the three items that are on sale at the moment. We will of course be adding more items to this list as well over the weekend and over the course of the next week, and which include an entire set of the Dashavatar or Kanjifa playing cards. Then we will also have separate cushion cover sets, Baluchari cushion cover sets for people who want to purchase those. and we also have a beautiful baluchari wall hanging. So what we realized with the baluchari weavers is that they said that they've now started diversifying. So that's why we are also putting on offer not just a sari, but we're also putting on offer a couple of other items that they have been weaving. And finally, lastly, we're also coming up with two very interesting series of postcards for those of you who are still interested in using snail mail. So that is the offering that we will be having for the current month. But we do plan to introduce a new box from either a different city or a different region every month. So this is the Bishnupur box is the first box for the culture box, and is also the first box of April. But come May, and we will have a new box on offer. So I would just lastly like to sign off by saying that, as I had mentioned, remember that we have very, very limited quantities, especially the collector's items. We only have one piece on offer. So if you want to get your hands on it, if you don't want to miss out, then we've already shared the link in the comment section to the Culture Box website. So please do go and have a look, and we hope to have you purchase with us soon. So, Chelsea, would you like to add on to what I've said?
Thank you very much, Anmol, for that great introduction to the Culture Box. And everyone, please stay tuned for announcements related to the upcoming merchandise and the upcoming curated boxes that we will be providing in the future. So, thank you all very much for watching, and see you soon on another live stream. Thank
Thank
you.
you, everyone.